This is episode 10 of the Shame Proof Your Life podcast, the one where I talk about money shame. I'm your host and shame coach, Danita Bremer. In this podcast, I tell stories from my life to fulfill a prompting I've had for far too long. I help you tell your story in a way that you see you aren't alone and there's nothing wrong with you. I want you to stop believing the lie you aren't enough so you can live a life of freedom and fulfillment the way God intended. Okay, lesson 10. Episode 10, double digits here. So exciting. Today, I want to talk about money shame. I kind of started talking about it last week in the episode with the tennis skirt. It was sort of loosely about money, right? But I want to dive a little deeper into kind of some lessons I've learned, where I learned them, how I learned them, and give you a couple of tips for your own learning. Okay, so the first lesson that I think most of us learn in our outer culture is that money is hard, right? How many of us have heard the saying, money doesn't just grow on trees, which is kind of funny because money is made out of paper and paper comes from trees. So it kind of actually does grow on trees. But as I look back on my life, immediately as I was thinking about money and the shame that I have experienced around money, a few lessons came up right away. And the first one was that money is hard. And I think I learned this because I watched my dad work hard labor jobs. So I've mentioned before in a previous episode about how he was a trash man. I know when I was littler, or maybe before I was born, he was a janitor. And then when we moved to Washington from California, he immediately got a job at a lumber mill. Now, if you don't have a concept of what that means, let me just spell it out for you. So, our society really depends a lot on wood as a resource. Now, there are people who go out into the forest and fell trees and then haul them to a mill. Basically, the mill takes the trees with, the bark and all and turns them into planks of wood. They, cut them down, sand them, prepare them, whatever. I don't actually even know. I know I went to the lumber mill a few times. So I remember seeing the mill and different things, a lot of heavy machinery, large equipment. And I know I heard my dad talk about it a lot. My most distinct memory is I think it happened during the winter because when you work at a lumber mill, you're outside the whole time. There's no like inside, really. I mean, there's some covered areas, but it's all kind of open. So during the winter, my dad would go to work and it would be very cold. So he would wear long underwear underneath his regular clothes, his jeans, his flannels, his jackets, and then he would wear these boots. And this was about from my age of like 8 or 9. He would wear these boots that were like winter boots, so they didn't let your feet breathe at all. And when he would come home and take his boots off, his feet would literally be steaming, right? Because he had to keep his feet warm, right? And he just described a lot of, the machinery would need to be fixed. Like there would be a backlog of logs or wood or whatever. I don't know all the processes that happened. And a person would have to go and like move the wood around to get it figured out. I know he talked about people getting their fingers crushed or cut off. And it's kind of a dangerous job, right? And then it's also shift work. So I believe they had 3 shifts basically going all around the clock. Because I remember my dad would sometimes work a shift where he would get home at like 8 or 9 or 10 p.m. And it was just really hard labor, like physically difficult for the money that you're making. He worked there for a long time and he kind of worked his way up. He learned how to, drive the big trucks and work the machinery. And then he got a different job, still similar though, working at a calcium mine where they would mine calcium, they would package it up. I don't actually know very well, but he talked about how they would use it to fertilize like golf courses. So again, heavy machinery, trucks, like outside all the time. So I think the first lesson about money is that money is hard to get, right? You have to work really hard at it. My dad also had this saying, I know he said it a million times, was don't borrow money, but if you have to, pay it back as soon as possible. So as I look back now that I'm an adult with my own kids and I'm thinking about these stories from my past, I think that that is such an interesting thing for him to teach because he never had a lot of money. He dropped out of high school. He started working, jobs that in the what, early 80s, late 70s, probably he was making 8, $9 an hour, maybe less even. And how could you get anywhere in life without borrowing money? I had to borrow money or like I got grants and stuff for college. I borrow money to pay for my house, right? So most people in our culture do borrow money. And I just think it's so interesting that he had this lesson, this idea that you shouldn't borrow money ever. Now, I know that he actually did borrow money. He borrowed money from his parents quite a few times as I was growing up. I believe he always paid it back. I don't know for sure, but I just think that that's such a fascinating lesson coming from somebody who worked really hard labor jobs, did not make a lot of money. When I was in college, I'm pretty sure I made more than my parents did. And I don't have a lesson here, but I just think it's so fascinating. The second lesson that I learned about money growing up was that money is stressful. And as I reflected back, I can't really pinpoint exactly where I picked this up. I want to say it was just from body language and facial expression, mostly from my mom. I know that she worried about money a lot. I know that her and my dad had lots of discussions and arguments about money. The feeling I got was that my dad didn't worry as much, but my mom worried a lot. And the only thing I can really say is that body language and facial expression communicate a lot. I don't really remember specific words that were said, but I do know that like she just felt like there never was enough money. One thing I think about a lot is that my parents always seemed to need a new car. Like, it felt like every 2 to 3 years we were buying a new car or something was broken down with the car, wrong with the car, like maybe even if it still ran. I remember one time my mom got this Subaru and it was a little bit newer. It was like, "Ooh, we got a fancy car." It had electric windows and things like that. But we lived where we had to drive on a dirt road every day, and sometimes it would get washboardy, and so the the electrical parts kind of shook loose or something, and at a certain point, like, the windows wouldn't go up and down anymore, the windshield wipers wouldn't work because everything was, electrical. So, anyway, I don't know if that was, like, necessarily the best choice, but my point is that they never were willing to invest in something that was a little more expensive. It was always like, what what can we do right now that we can afford or that is the most affordable, the least expensive? It was always, this scarcity of money. The other thing I think about is last week I talked about how I played tennis in school. I also participated in the activity which we called Knowledge Bowl. Some people call it Quiz Bowl. And I was in band. So these activities often required field trips or like driving away an hour or more to visit other schools and compete. And most of the time, we would either leave school a little bit early or leave right after school. So we were gone during dinner time and we would stop at like fast food places and buy food for dinner. And so I'd have to ask my parents, like, can I have $5 for dinner? And my dad was always very willing. Here's $5. My mom, I can't, like I said, I can't specifically remember her saying anything about it, but it was like always this tension, right? That like the kids need money. Where are we going to get this money from? Kind of thing. And I remember one time because I'm internalizing these lessons that like money is hard, money is stressful, and I don't want to add to the stress in the family. So one time I brought my like 26 cents change home after like a tennis meet or something like that. And my dad kind of laughed at me. He was like, "Why are you giving this to me?" And I remember being kind of awkward, like, well, I don't know. It's just like what I can do, right? And he was just like, "You don't need to give me back the 26 cents." So, I do know that as I was learning these lessons, I I also as a child or a teenager felt pressure to not add to the stress in the family relating to money. And that kind of goes back to what I talked about last week, which was this idea that if I want things that cost money, then I'm causing somebody else's negative emotion. I'm adding to the stress, or just I shouldn't want things, right? And it's so human to want things. How do you just not want things? So I think that for me at least added to my shame a little bit. The other lesson that came to me immediately was that money equals value. And I think this is also a lesson that's really hard to not learn, no matter who you are, how you grew up. Money holds value in our society. It's what allows you, it is an exchange of value. It just represents value. Like, hey, here's a dollar. Now I get a candy bar, right? But it's very hard to separate the monetary value from like what I would call personal value or inherent value. So when we learn like, oh, money represents value and when you pay for something it's just an exchange of value. I give money, you give me something in exchange. That concept is different than the concept that we all have inherent value just because we're human and worthy, because God made us, because whatever, right? Because that's just how it is. It's difficult to separate those two concepts when you see like the cool kids at school have nice cars that they're driving or they have the name brand clothes. So the people that have more money have the things that carry influence or status, right? And the other way I see this is with my grandparents. So, my grandparents I know worked really hard. They also worked hard labor, but then later on, they owned their own motorcycle shop and they sold motorcycles. And then even after that, they managed apartment complexes and did a variety of other work, but they worked really hard their whole lives to kind of save up for retirement and to have money for when they weren't working. And they had, I have actually no idea how much money they had, but they lived as if they had a comfortable amount of money to do what they wanted to do, to pay for their medical expenses, to travel a little bit. They had a motor home that they traveled across the Western United States with quite a few times. They would, drive the 4 to 5 hours to the bigger cities in Washington, and, like, sometimes they would go to the temple or, things like that, and they would eat out. Um, those were things that my family didn't necessarily have money for, and I also remember, one time my grandparents talking about something, and they were saying, "Oh, that's the wrong checkbook." So I know they had multiple accounts. As a kid, I was like, "Oh my gosh, they have so much money that they have 2 or more checking accounts. That's awesome." And they also just the way they lived, their home was very comfortable. They had nice furniture and, things like that. They had acreage and now I know that, like, probably all of that took very little money comparatively, but it was almost like we in our family had this idea that, like, grandma and grandpa are somehow better because they have money, and my parents did borrow money from them. So, I think I also internalized this lesson that, like, if you have money, you are somehow a better human. And I do think that that's a hard lesson to get away from. And the last lesson I want to mention is that education solves for money problems. I don't know who told me or where exactly I got this idea, but from a very young age, from before the age of 10, I for sure knew that I wanted to go to college. And what was in the back of my mind was that if I can go to college, then I'll have more money. I'll get a better job. I'll have more money. I'll have a better lifestyle. I won't be as stressed. Those kinds of things. So as I've been reflecting, I've been really thinking about and kind of laughing at some of the lessons that I learned from my own parents and grandparents and the people around me about money. Now, what I want to offer is that all of these ideas about money are just thoughts that somebody decided at some point, and then these thoughts grew like wildfire. Or maybe they're just thoughts that come to us because we're human, because we think like, oh, I have to work really hard. And when I work really hard, I get money. Therefore, money is hard, right? Money is stressful. Money causes negative emotion, right? That's just a thought. It doesn't have to be true necessarily. There are plenty of people in the world who have lots of money and are still stressed, right? It's not necessarily a one to one correlation. So, for this episode, the kind of tip or tool I want to teach you is to really think about what subconscious lessons did you learn about money when you were growing up? And this is not something that you can just sit down in one sitting and write them all out. It's something that you will have to think about as you navigate your life over the coming days and weeks, is just being aware of what you do think about money. And just that awareness sometimes is enough when we like bring an idea like education solves for money. Now I can see that as like, oh, that's an interesting thought that I picked up along the way. I now know with my experience that it's not necessarily true. There are plenty of educated people who have no money and plenty of non educated people who have lots of money. But as a young person, it's a relationship I created in my mind. So to just kind of explore those relationships, how does money make you feel? Does it make you feel shame? When I think about this lesson that money equals value, or people who have more money are somehow better, that makes me feel shame because growing up, money always seemed to be scarce. So I always in my mind put myself in the bucket of somebody who doesn't have money or doesn't have enough money, therefore is less than. And shame always says, like, there's something wrong with me. So think about that relationship between how you think about money, what you believe about money, and how you feel when you're thinking about money. Is money just for having? Is it for spending? Is it for saving? Like, what is the purpose of money in your life? And then the other thing I just want to mention here is that it's really important for us to know that we make sense. So, as you think about these lessons that are in your mind, but you maybe don't consciously know where they came from, as you reflect and think back on, what did my parents teach me? What did my grandparents teach me? What did school teach me? What did my friends teach me? Right? All these people, this outer culture, TV, music, things like that. We pick up lessons from all of that. And once you can kind of identify, or at least point yourself in the right direction of, where did I learn this thought or this belief? Then you allow yourself to be like, "Oh, well, no wonder I think money is hard. My parents always had to work really hard to get money." Right? My mom was always stressed. That also sent me the message that money was hard. And when you know that you make sense, it is so much easier to change, if you want, how you're thinking and feeling. If you don't know why you think or feel the way you do, it's really difficult to change it, right? You have to understand it. First, you have to be aware of it. Then you can decide, do I want to change this or not? It's kind of like when we go to the doctor and we say, "Oh, yeah, I'm having some pain in my arm." And the doctor's like, "Oh, let's figure out why," right? That's always the first step, is the diagnosis. Is it a broken bone? Is it a torn tendon? Like, why is the pain there? Then once you have the diagnosis, you'll know which direction to move. So that's kind of how I view it, is that it's so useful to know why you think the way you think, because then you can be like, "Oh, well, that totally makes sense." And then you can decide, do I want to keep this or not? Okay, that's enough for now. And so are you. Go be you and follow the spirit. If you resonate with my story, I would love to connect with you. Find me on Instagram and Facebook at Danita Bremer Coaching. And if you're interested in taking the tips and tools I offer here a little deeper, please visit my website, danitabremer.com, and schedule a free session.